a legendary Hollywood family, a quiet Brentwood home, and one December night that turned a celebrated legacy into a crime scene. What really happened behind those locked doors and why the truth still refuses to settle may change how we understand this entire case. For decades, the Reiner name stood for warmth, storytelling, and family. Rob Reiner wasn't just a director, he was a symbol of emotional honesty in Hollywood, a filmmaker who built entire careers around love, loyalty, and human connection. Michelle Singer Reiner, his wife, stayed largely outside the spotlight, but those close to the family described her as the emotional anchor, the quiet force that kept everything balanced. To the public, the Reiners represented stability in an industry known for chaos. That's why what happened next didn't just shock Hollywood, it unsettled it. Because when people talk about this case, they aren't just reacting to a crime. They're grappling with a contradiction. How does a family so closely associated with empathy and connection unravel into something this violent, this confusing, and this unresolved? On December 13th, 2025, Rob and Michelle attended a Christmas party hosted by Conan O'Brien, an evening meant to be light, celebratory, and filled with familiar industry faces. But beneath the festive surface, something was already wrong. Witnesses later described tension between Rob and his son, Nick Reiner. Not a quiet disagreement, not a subtle strain, a confrontation that made other guests uncomfortable enough to remember it clearly. This matters because it sets the emotional tone, not just for the night, but for everything that followed. Nick Reiner had long struggled publicly, multiple stints in rehab, years of instability, a complicated relationship with his father that even friends acknowledged had never fully healed. Rob loved his son deeply, but those close to the family say love alone wasn't fixing what was broken. And that pressure, emotional, psychological, unresolved, had been building quietly for years. Hey Race, the first rehook, several guests from that party later said something chilling. Nick didn't just seem upset. He seemed detached, as if he had already checked out of the moment entirely. No one imagined that within hours, that unresolved tension would follow the family home. When Rob Reiner and Michelle Singer Reiner left the Christmas party that night, nothing about their exit suggested catastrophe. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, no visible breakdown that would later make headlines. Witnesses didn't describe chaos. They described something quieter, heavier. Two parents moving with intention, almost deliberately, guiding their troubled son away from the public eye. To anyone watching, it looked like protection, a final attempt to keep a family matter private. But what no one realized at the time was that this decision to leave calmly, to go home together, would become one of the most critical moments in the entire investigation. Because once the front door of the Reiner home closed, the public narrative ended, and whatever followed happened in total silence. Investigators would later say that the hours after the party were the most difficult to reconstruct. No neighbors heard screams. No security alarms were triggered. No frantic calls were made. In a quiet Brentwood neighborhood, where even small disturbances carry across the street, there was nothing. That absence of sound became its own kind of evidence. It suggested not a sudden explosion, but something far more controlled, far more contained. In the early morning darkness of December 14th, something deeply violent unfolded inside that home. The exact moment remains disputed, but forensic indicators would later place the tragedy well before sunrise, during the hours when the city sleeps and defenses are lowest. The house itself showed no signs of intrusion. Every door was locked, every window intact. There was no forced entry, no broken latch, no indication that someone unfamiliar had entered in desperation or panic. Whoever was inside didn't need to force their way in. They belonged there or had been allowed there. That detail alone narrowed the universe of possibilities dramatically. As investigators would later explain, crimes involving extreme violence usually carry noise, struggle, disruption. But in this case, the stillness was eerie. It suggested proximity, familiarity, and a level of emotional complexity that made the case immediately different from an ordinary homicide. This wasn't random. This wasn't opportunistic. This was personal. Hours later, when Romy Reiner arrived at the house, it wasn't because she sensed danger. It was because something felt wrong. Her parents weren't answering calls. That, by itself, was unusual. According to those close to the family, Rob and Michelle were reliable, responsive, grounded in routine. Silence from both of them at once raised alarms. When Romy entered the home, the reality hit instantly. The scene she encountered was catastrophic. Rob and Michelle were unresponsive. The house that had once been filled with warmth and conversation was now frozen in aftermath. Emergency services were called immediately. Paramedics arrived within minutes, followed closely by law enforcement. What began as concern escalated into shock. Michelle was still alive at that moment, but barely. And this is where the case crosses a line that cannot be uncrossed. According to prosecutors, during transport to the hospital, Michelle made a statement identifying her attacker. In legal terms, it's known as a dying declaration, an exception so serious, so rare, that courts allow it to be heard even though it is technically hearsay. The reasoning is stark: a person who knows they are dying has no incentive to lie. If that statement is admitted at trial, it could become one of the most powerful pieces of evidence the prosecution has. But even this moment, which seems clear on paper, is layered with complexity. Because Michelle did not speak publicly, there is no recording, no independent witness beyond those present. And the content of that statement, while referenced in filings and reports, has not been fully aired in open court. Its interpretation, context, and exact wording are expected to become a central battlefield in the legal fight ahead. Still, the immediate result was swift. Nick Reiner became the primary focus of the investigation almost instantly. Yet hayraced were the narrative fractures. Nick has consistently denied involvement. From the earliest hours, he claimed he was not present when the fatal injuries occurred. And more than that, he accused his sister Romy of knowing more than she was saying. That accusation wasn't made through press conferences or dramatic public statements. It surfaced quietly, through investigative channels, through interviews, through legal conversations that never reached the headlines directly. But its impact was explosive, because once that accusation existed, every detail had to be reconsidered. Timelines, movements, statements, even motivations. Romy, through close sources and later through legal representation, denied this completely. She maintained that she arrived only after she couldn't reach her parents, that she discovered the scene, that she did exactly what any daughter would do, called for help. Her account has remained consistent. And yet, the contradiction between the siblings became the emotional core of the case. As detectives examined the home, they noted something unsettling. There were no signs of a chaotic struggle, no overturned furniture, no evidence of a prolonged fight that moved room to room. Instead, the scene suggested closeness, proximity, an encounter that unfolded within reach. This matters because crimes driven by sudden rage often leave disorder behind. But this scene suggested something else entirely: control, intent, and time. Here comes another critical rehook. Neighbors were interviewed extensively. Every house along the street. No one heard anything. No raised voices. No sounds of distress. One investigator later described the silence as too complete. In a neighborhood like that, where dogs bark and cars echo, the absence of sound stood out more than noise ever could. Silence doesn't always mean calm. Sometimes it means domination. By the time the home was sealed off and officially declared a crime scene, the reality had settled in. Rob Reiner was gone. Michelle Singer Reiner would not survive. And the family had crossed into a world where truth is no longer emotional. It is procedural, forensic, and unforgiving. As word began to spread quietly through Hollywood, reactions were muted at first. Not disbelief, confusion. People struggled to reconcile the family they knew with the details emerging behind closed doors. The house told a story, but it spoke in fragments, half-truths, and contradictions that refused to align neatly. The first problem was time. Determining the precise moment when the violence occurred became nearly impossible. Medical examiners could provide an estimated window, but not a definitive hour. And in a case where every person of interest claimed to be elsewhere at critical moments, that uncertainty was devastating. A few hours' ambiguity meant the difference between alibi and accusation, between suspicion and clearance. Then there was the physical evidence, or more accurately, the lack of it. There was no murder weapon recovered at the scene, no obvious instrument left behind, no item out of place that could be immediately identified as the source of the fatal injuries. There were mentions of tension, of concern, of conversations held behind closed doors. Nothing concrete enough to scream danger, but enough, in hindsight, to suggest that the family was under strain. And at the center of those accounts, again and again, was Nick. Some described him as struggling. Others used words like volatile, isolated, unpredictable. A few recalled moments that, at the time, seemed like emotional outbursts but now felt like warning signs ignored. Importantly, these accounts were not uniform. There was no single narrative everyone agreed on. That inconsistency made it impossible to paint a simple portrait of who Nick was or what he was capable of. And that ambiguity cut both ways. Because while prosecutors began to build a picture of escalation, the defense saw opportunity. Inconsistency could mean unreliability. Emotional descriptions could be exaggerated by grief. Memory, especially after trauma, is fragile, and the defense would later argue that what people believed they remembered was colored by tragedy, not truth. But then came the digital evidence. Phones were seized, laptops collected, message histories extracted, and within that digital footprint, investigators hoped to find clarity, something definitive, something time-stamped, something that could anchor the timeline in reality. What they found instead was another layer of complexity. Some communications were missing, not deleted in a way that screamed concealment, but absent in a manner that suggested gaps. Conversations that seemed to jump from one emotional state to another with no bridge in between. Threads that felt incomplete. Whether those gaps were the result of deletion, device changes, or simple coincidence became a matter of intense scrutiny. And in modern investigations, coincidence is rarely accepted at face value. Then came the medical findings. Their case would be built not on one explosive revelation, but on a constellation of facts that, when viewed together, pointed in only one direction. The defense, however, came in swinging. They framed the prosecution's narrative as incomplete, speculative, and dangerously reliant on assumptions. From their perspective, the state was asking jurors to fill in gaps with emotion rather than evidence, to substitute tragedy for proof. And at the center of their strategy was one brutal assertion that the case was being driven by grief and public expectation, not by facts that met the standard of beyond a reasonable doubt. Every pretrial motion became a battleground. One of the earliest and most consequential fights centered on admissibility, specifically what the jury would be allowed to hear. The dying declaration loomed large. The prosecution viewed it as foundational, a direct link between victim and accused. The defense viewed it as unreliable, unrecorded, and vulnerable to misinterpretation. They argued that in moments of extreme trauma, memory fractures, perception distorts, and certainty collapses. To allow such a statement, they claimed, would unfairly prejudice the jury. The judge listened, carefully, methodically, and in that silence, the fate of the entire case seemed to hang. Another front opened around digital evidence. The prosecution wanted to introduce patterns of communication, behavioral indicators, and contextual data that suggested escalation. The defense countered that such evidence was circumstantial at best and misleading at worst. They argued that fragments of messages, taken out of emotional context, could be made to imply intent where none existed. In a world where everyone texts impulsively, they said, meaning cannot be inferred from tone alone. This back and forth revealed something critical. The trial would not be about what jurors felt, it would be about what they were permitted to see. Behind closed doors, legal teams pored over jury instructions, aware that wording alone could tip the balance. How would reasonable doubt be defined? How would intent be framed? Would the jury be instructed to consider family dynamics as context or warned against letting emotion cloud judgment? Every word mattered. As the trial date approached, media attention intensified but remained strangely restrained. There were no leaks of graphic details, no anonymous sources fueling speculation. That restraint created its own tension. The absence of noise made the case feel heavier, more serious, more consequential. This wasn't a spectacle. It was a reckoning. When opening statements finally arrived, the courtroom was charged with anticipation. The prosecution spoke first. They painted a picture not of a monster, but of a moment, one shaped by pressure, emotional volatility, and proximity. They emphasized trust, access, opportunity. They reminded jurors that the most dangerous acts often occur not in alleys or shadows, but in homes, between people who know each other intimately. Their tone was sober, almost restrained, as if they understood that overstatement would only undermine their credibility. Then the defense stood and shifted the ground entirely. They challenged the premise of the case from the outset. They reminded jurors that tragedy does not equal guilt, that suspicion is not proof, that assumptions, even reasonable ones, have no place in a criminal verdict. They urged the jury to resist narrative gravity, to examine each claim in isolation rather than being swept up by the emotional weight of the story. It was a masterclass in doubt. Witnesses followed. Experts testified. Each one added a layer, but also introduced new questions. Medical professionals explained injury patterns, but acknowledged margins of uncertainty. Digital analysts discussed metadata, timestamps, and usage patterns, but admitted that interpretation depends heavily on assumptions. Even law enforcement witnesses, calm and professional, could not escape the reality that parts of the timeline remained unclear. And every unclear moment became oxygen for the defense. Perhaps the most chilling moments came not from testimony, but from silence when jurors were left to sit with unresolved questions. Why no weapon? Why no noise? Why no definitive timestamp? Why no eyewitness? In most cases, one of those gaps might be survivable. Here they stacked. The prosecution responded by urging jurors to consider the totality of the evidence. They argued that crimes within families rarely leave clean lines, that the absence of chaos can itself be evidence of control, that familiarity breeds vulnerability. They asked jurors to trust logic over discomfort. But logic, in this case, required inference. And inference is fragile. As closing arguments loomed, the courtroom atmosphere shifted again. What began as analytical became existential. Jurors were no longer just evaluating evidence, they were confronting the limits of certainty. Could they say, without hesitation, that they knew what happened inside that house? Or were they being asked to choose the most plausible version of events rather than the proven one? That distinction is everything. Outside the courtroom, the family remained largely silent. No public pleas, no emotional appeals. That silence, too, was interpreted differently depending on perspective. Some saw dignity, others saw distance. In a case defined by absence of sound, of evidence, of clarity, even silence became symbolic. When deliberations began, there was no rush, no immediate verdict. Hours turned into days. Each passing moment fueled speculation, but revealed nothing. Jurors emerged expressionless. The weight of their task was visible, because they were not just deciding guilt or innocence. They were deciding whether uncertainty itself was enough to acquit. And regardless of the outcome, one truth had already crystallized: the courtroom had not resolved the mystery, it had simply reframed it. What happened inside that house remained contested, fragmented, and emotionally radioactive. The legal process had not delivered closure. It had exposed how elusive closure truly is. And as the verdict approached, one question echoed louder than any testimony ever could: when truth lives behind closed doors, can justice ever truly force it into the light? This case refuses to resolve itself neatly because it isn't just about guilt or innocence. It's about how families fracture under pressure, how love and fear can exist side by side, and how public legacy collides with private suffering. Rob Reiner spent his life telling stories about connection, about the fragile bonds that hold people together. In a cruel twist, his final chapter has become a story defined by separation, by competing truths, by silence where clarity should be. The legal process will continue. Evidence will be argued, timelines challenged, declarations tested. A jury will eventually hear the facts stripped of emotion and narrative. But even then, something will remain unresolved. Because courts determine guilt, they don't heal families. Nick Reiner says he is innocent. Rob Reiner says the truth is already known. Somewhere between those two realities lies a moment inside that Brentwood home that no camera recorded, no witness heard, and no headline can fully explain. And that's why this story matters. Not because it involves Hollywood, but because it exposes how fragile even the most admired lives can be when unresolved pain is left to grow in silence. The question isn't just what happened that night. It's whether the full truth, emotional, psychological, human, will ever surface at all. And if it does, who will be left standing when it does? Subscribe for continued coverage as this story unfolds.